My apologies to those who are watching previously. Just a few moments ago, I switched out of that one and into this one. There were some orientation issues. Again, my name is Christopher Diorio, and this is an edition of ChrisChat. Yesterday, at approximately sometime in the evening hours, the United States government launched 59 Tomahawk missiles at an airfield in Syria. Apparently, as a result or as a response to the gassing of Syrian citizens. We still don't know at this point, apparently, what or who was responsible for that. However, the questions have been posed regarding what the authority is that the United States government has, specifically the president, when it comes to authorizing military action. And this is not a unique question. This is something that has happened, frankly, or the questions related to this power date back to revolutionary times, at the beginning of our Congress and of our nation post-Constitution. So what I want to talk about just briefly, or as briefly as I can, is give you a general sense as to what the varying authorities are between both the Congress and the president when it relates to military authority. Because there's a lot of conflict as to who can do what and what has to be done and whether a certain action is undertaken constitutionally or not. So I want to go through just a brief outline for you related to both of these two entities of our government and what their specific authorities are under the Constitution. First, the U.S. Congress, the Constitution itself, and if you don't have your handy-dandy copy of the Constitution with you during these things, perhaps it would help you. And if you don't have one, again, if you want one to have for your own, send me a message and I will contact you and I'll get this into your hands as soon as possible. But if you look at the U.S. Constitution, it grants Congress and the president different responsibilities over military action. And there's long been disputes over where one power begins and one power ends. And this is not unique to one particular branch of, or one particular political ideology. This particular question dates back 200 years. So why not discuss it now? The Constitution gives Congress the power to declare war. Under Article 1, Section 8, they have this authority to declare war. They also have other powers that are granted specifically to them, enumerated powers that address this. They have the power, Congress does, to raise armies, to raise a navy, to provide for the common defense, is something specifically inside the Constitution vested in or enumerated in congressional powers. They have the powers to grant letters of marque and reprisal and things of that nature, which is long, old-fashioned stuff. But a lot of these powers are vested in the Congress. And Congress also has the power to restrict or control funding for military authority, and that will be key later on. So while the Constitution empowers Congress to have certain authority, the president has the power to wage war as the commander-in-chief. Congress has the power to declare war, and in fact, the power to declare or authorize hostilities at any level and then to pay for the military action that's undertaken. If you look, though, at Article 2, Section 1, which creates the executive, it says, and I'll read right from, the executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States of America. The word vested, if you look at it with certain people, will say that vested means that the powers that are granted to the executive here, in this case the president, are not just the ones that are written here. The term vested means that they also get more executive authority that is unwritten. So you'll see a lot of presidents refer to this vested authority. Folks arguing that just because it's not written here, I still have authority to do certain things. So we'll come back to that word vested in a little bit. Most legal scholars, if you look at what the president's powers are, will tell you that presidents can order United States troops to fight when the country is attacked, if attack appears imminent, or if there's a national emergency. But you can talk to presidents from either side of the political aisle, and they will differ with you as to what authority Congress has over their ability to initiate military force in other types of combat situations. Presidents have, for the most part, since World War II, have demonstrated a much greater power or desire to wage military conflict that borders on, if not actually steps over the line to becoming a war. But this is pretty unique to post-World War II America. The president has had the commander-in-chief authority since 1789, but the notion that an executive can go to war whenever they want and basically ignore Congress is very much a post-World War II attitude. Since the Korean conflict, presidential use of military authority without congressional authorization usually rests on two criteria. First, the military action is intended to defend U.S. persons or property or national interests. Secondly, this authority or military operations are not, or what using their term, they fall clearly short of the traditional understanding of war. So now it's semantic in essence, that we're not engaged, the military action is not engaged in war, therefore it's not covered and it's not restricted. That's why when Harry Truman puts us into Korea, he doesn't call it the Korean War. We do now, but he referred to it as a police action. LBJ, when we sent troops into Vietnam, didn't declare war. We call it the Vietnam War, but there was never a declaration of war. That was a response to the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which allowed him to send troops to protect American interests in the Gulf. This is not something that is unique. As I said, it dates back a long time. But if you look at the two, Congress has the power to declare and has all of the other authority related to the military, to raise the armies and to pay for them. But the president has the power to engage in. It seems obvious, and most people who study the Constitution will tell you that the framers of the Constitution very deliberately divided war powers between these two branches for a variety of reasons, chief among them to induce the two branches to work together when it comes to such a vital issue as committing American lives or putting American lives in danger. As I said, it's since the Korean War, Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution, which refers to the president as the commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy of the United States. It's right there in your Constitution. This particularly has been interpreted to mean the president has the power to initiate hostilities whenever they want, short of declaring war, without consulting Congress. Historically, however, for those originalists out there, and I know you're out there, what the framers actually meant, if you look at the history, what they meant by that clause was that once war is declared by Congress, it is the president's responsibility as commander-in-chief to direct the war. Alexander Hamilton spoke about this. He wrote about it in Federalist 69 in such terms when he said that the president, lacking the power to declare war, would have the direction of war when it's authorized or when it's begun. When it's authorized or when it's begun. The president acting alone was only authorized to repel sudden attacks. So if you look at again, parsing words, the decision to withhold from him the power to declare war, but they didn't withhold from him the power to make war, which at that point gave the president sort of emergency powers to address emergency issues in the case of foreign attack or something of that nature if our interests were threatened. The framers, again, assigned to Congress what most people look at as being a senior status in a partnership with the president, specifically for the purpose of conducting foreign policy. Congress possesses the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations, to raise and support the army, to provide for the common defense, and to declare war. Congress shares powers with the president to make treaties, to appoint ambassadors. All of these things are joint partnership powers. There are only two things, really, when you look at presidential authority. Only two powers that the president has related to his commander-in-chief power. He has the commander-in-chief power, commander-in-chief of the armed forces, and the power to receive ambassadors. That's all of the power that the president has in terms of addressing foreign countries. One of them is pretty big, the power to make war. The framers think about when they drafted the Constitution. They believe that history at that point sort of was the greatest testimonial as to the executive authority and their, for want of a better term, their penchant for war. They'd just come out of a years-long, multi-year conflict with a monarch who had exclusive, authority over the military. James Madison, in writing about this, wrote a letter to Thomas Jefferson saying this: the Constitution supposes what the history of all government demonstrates, that the executive is the branch of power most interested in war and most prone to it. It has, accordingly, with studied care, the Constitution vested the question of war in the legislature. Even then, back in the 1790s, after we're sitting there with a Constitution, we still had presidents who ignored the provisions. John Adams attacks France. Thomas Jefferson goes after the Barbary pirates. All of these military actions undertaken without the authority of Congress, and they were left to lie. There have been 35 separate declarations of war, and more than half of them occurred before 1820. We spent most of our time there dealing with minor incursions that we then, in order to raise money, declared as war. In looking at this Syria action specifically now, this, many experts have said, and many on the other side have said opposite, have said that this sort of warrants a request for congressional authorization. Planning to use any kind of military force in Syria without authorization is kind of it's a real stretch of the constitutional authority, because as we talked about, there's no American interest that's been threatened here. There's not been any movement against us. This is not an action to defend U.S. soil or persons or territories or property. So it falls outside of that usual constitutional understanding as to why we're doing something. This kind of sets a potentially dangerous precedent, because now we're looking at sort of a presidential unilateralism because there's no, as I said, there's no U.S. person or property at stake. No plausible rationale for self-defense exists here. So this really puts a strain or a stretch on what the Constitution allows or provides related to presidential authority. The Congress has the power, however, to set troop limits, to withdraw funds, to do any number of things to restrict the presidential authority to engage in military conflict. So we talk about this vesting authority, and that's where the power comes from. Many executives will argue to address military action without having to go to Congress. We had, as I discussed, the Korean conflict, the Vietnam War, and at that point, then President Nixon was not receptive terribly to any actions undertaken by, or requests for folks to bring soldiers home to end the conflict. And so Congress in 1973, and you'll hear this discussed many times, Congress in 1973 enacted what is now known as the War Powers Resolution or the War Powers Act. This was done after a period of growing congressional concerns over the unilateral presidential use of military force in Vietnam. Among other things, this particular War Powers Act, what it provides for, and it was passed, President Nixon, when the resolution was passed into law, President Nixon vetoed the bill, and Congress overrode his veto. So from the very beginning of the War Powers Act, or the resolution, there has always been executive conflict with it. Among other things, the president is required to terminate, just in brief, and I'll get specifically into terms, the president is required to terminate combat in a foreign territory within 60 days unless there's congressional authorization to continue. This war powers authorization also sought to provide presidents with some degree of leeway, understanding that there are times when the executive acts in a certain way with military authority. So they provide some leeway, but there are rules to respond to attacks or other emergencies. That the measure, the War Powers Resolution, was intended to provide not a hammer per se to beat down the president's authority, but more in an effort to coordinate between the two branches, between the executive and legislative branch, on the use of force, when, how, the rules under which we send troops off and put them in harm's way. It talks about starting a conflict. One of the many flaws, frankly, of the War Powers Act is it doesn't talk about how to wind down a conflict. It talks about how to start it. It doesn't really talk about how we end it. So there is a flaw there. But there are certain provisions. The War Powers Resolution requires the following things. It says that the executive military authority by the president can only be used in 3 circumstances. A, if Congress has actually declared war. B, if there's some statutory authorization that permits the use of military force by the executive. And C, if there's a national emergency created by, and again, I'm repeating myself here because I feel like I have to, a national emergency created by an attack on the United States, its territories, its possessions, or the United States Armed Forces. So if our forces are attacked, we're allowed to respond. If our territories or possessions if those are attacked, we're allowed to respond. If possible, second part, if possible, the president should, it's recommended that the president consult with Congress before engaging military forces. This is not consulting with the entirety of Congress. Consulting with Congress simply means usually speaking with the heads of the major, speaking with the Speaker of the House, the President of the Senate, the Minority Leader on both sides, the Minority Whips on both sides, Secretary of Defense, etc. All, these particular individuals are brought into a room, and there is indication given that we are going to use military force. If, however, the president chooses, or for whatever reason decides not to consult with Congress, within 48 hours of engaging in military action, the president is required, under the War Powers Act, to report to Congress. The language is very specific. Must report to Congress within 48 hours, and then after that, make continuing reports to Congress related to what the military authority is doing and how it's being utilized. Any use of force other than that authorized by a declaration of war or statutory authority is limited to 60 days. And if the president violates that 60-day rule, there is either some sort of extenuating circumstance, or if they violate that rule, Congress has the power to order the removal of armed forces from hostilities by legislative action. They can basically pass a resolution saying, bring our kids home. Here's the problem, however. In these circumstances, they pass a resolution. They basically pass a law and put it on the president's desk. What's likely to happen with a president who doesn't want to address this authority? Congress can stop the president by passing a law that commands him to stop the military action. The president's that law is subject to a presidential veto. And as long as the president, if you know your math, the Congress can override a veto. And it requires 2/3 in each house. All this takes is for, if you know the math, and 2/3 of the House, if 34 United States senators decide not to oppose the president's use of military force, and pretty much any president out there should be able to rally 34 people. At that point, the president can, bypass or avoid or ignore a congressional, order, for want of a better term, saying bring our folks home, even if 501 other members of Congress decide we want these kids home. If 34 people say no, we're siding with the president, we want it to continue to go on, then even though an overwhelming majority of Congress says you have to bring these soldiers back and these Marines back, the president can continue on. That's where we are right now with what the War Powers Act says. So where are we at with this particular action? There's a balance of powers issue here. He has, as I said, stretched the basic understanding of what presidential authority allows in these particular circumstances. He has the ability to utilize military force, but the rules under which that this president and every president before him, since we started going down this road, since World War II, definitely, has been to restrict the use of military authority, to fire missiles, to put troops on the ground, to put ships in harm's way, is limited to an act of self-defense related to our forces, our country, our borders, our armed forces, our territories, our property being attacked by a foreign invader. And at this point now, my question to anyone out there who is in support of this, and again, I'm not going to tell you it's wrong. What I am going to say is this: this president has to abide by the law. Tell me how this particular action addresses United States interests. Tell me how firing missiles at a Syrian airfield is related to an action that was self-defense in nature for us as a country. Tell me how United States territories or forces or other entities were placed in harm's way as a result of what happened in Syria. You cannot. But I'd be happy to hear you tell me that I'm wrong. It has to be to defend U.S. persons, property, or national interests, or fall somewhat short of an understanding of war. Perhaps that's the route that gets taken. But in terms of the authority to exercise the commander-in-chief powers to wage war, it seems to me that the action undertaken was constitutionally lacking. So that's what I have. If there are questions that people have, I'll sit tight for a couple of minutes and answer them for those of you who are still watching or listening. I understand right now Nikki Haley, who is the United States ambassador to the United Nations, is speaking on this issue, or may in fact have been speaking on this issue. She's obviously much more attuned to what's going on than I, and I'd certainly defer in some sense to what she might be saying about the specifics. But in terms of the constitutional aspect of this, the powers of the president are extremely limited, but because of that word, the vesting authority, the notion that perhaps the actions or authority that is not specifically enumerated in Article 2, Section 2 might have unwritten authority. But regardless of whether there's unwritten authority or not, the specific limitations deal with what we're doing here. So a question's been posed how this compares to previous encounters where that were somewhat like this. I will relate it back to the same country, but a different president. In 2013, President Obama sought to engage Syria in military action. And the president at that point, who had previously, on previous occasions, addressed military action, President Obama went to Congress in August of 2013 specifically to seek congressional authorization for a military strike against Syria over its alleged use of chemical weapons against its own people. President Obama went to Congress and asked for permission, and a lot of people thought that he was wrong to do so because it would set a dangerous precedent for future presidents. In dealing with Libya, same president, President Obama, had previously gone after Libya and engaged in military actions against Libya without congressional authority. But there, the president said that these actions were not a war for purposes of constitutional, restrictions. So that's that second one. If you fall short of an action being a war, then apparently most executives, at least previous presidents, would fall and say, well, that's not what we're doing. So in terms of Syria and actions related to use of chemical weapons, we have a very specific, contrary position here. This president went on his own and fired missiles 48 hours after an incident occurred that apparently tugged his emotional heartstrings. Or if you're much more cynical, you might say that there were other justifications behind what he did. This president didn't go to Congress. The previous president, same country, similar situation, chemical weapons used against their own people. And the president in 2013 went to Congress and asked for their authority. Question, why is it so hard for Congress to stop the president from basically starting a war? I can talk about the practicalities of it. Again, the president has this military authority as the commander-in-chief, and they can put people into military situations. But now you've got to deal with the practical aspect of it. I would like for a sitting congressperson or a senator to go home to their constituency and say, I took money away from the United States Armed Forces during a military conflict. The power here is a number of people waving the flag and being happy that we're able to punch something in the nose. But in terms of stopping the president from starting it, all they can do is what they have power to do. And their enumerated powers are to raise armies, to restrict troop numbers. They can close bases. They can restrict troop, the amounts of people in the armed forces. They can, they have the power of the purse. But honestly, in a practical sense, using the power of the purse against an executive when it comes to an active military action, not so much with this particular action because it's missiles and not soldiers, but we can't really do anything about that. It's hard politically to say I didn't support this, and I'll take you back to 9/11. When you had people signing the war, signing the up for the Patriot Act who had never read it, people authorizing military force and military engagement, almost unopposed. They could have done this on a voice vote. When it comes to military authority, far too many people in the Congress defer to the executive. Question about what about the UN? What are their rules? Can they intervene? This is a little bit beyond my pay grade as far as the UN is concerned, but there are a number of UN resolutions and conventions that address this. There are actually some conventions that discuss the use of gas like this, the Geneva Convention, etc. But the Geneva Convention and subsequent iterations of that refer to it being used in conflict when a war is actually undertaken. This is not for purposes necessarily of what we determine a conflict or a war. This is a civil, action within a country to suppress or a certain group of people. Is it a crime? Quite possibly, yes. Is it a violation of certain basic humanity principles of humanity? Absolutely. Could it be? Is it something that you could, if you dragged Bashar al-Assad before The Hague or something of that nature, before a crimes tribunal, could he be prosecuted? Very likely, extremely likely. But in terms of what the UN can do, they're restricted. In fact, they have more restrictions on themselves than we do, because they have to deal with 211 countries getting on board and a Security Council wherein they have members that sit on the Security Council, Russia being among them, that very likely would oppose any action undertaken by UN forces. Can they do this? Can the UN ignore it? It wouldn't be the first time. But they sort of have to speak. They will speak on it, whether they do something about it, whether they put their own. The UN needs coalition forces. They need other countries to submit their military to under UN control. The United States doesn't like to do that anymore. We don't want to put no country really wants to put their forces under the authority of another executive. For one, we have generals. We don't want to submit our generals to theirs. Unless you have a true coalition, it just doesn't work. Okay, so that's what I have for you today. I apologize for the abortive start early on, but hopefully this was helpful. As always, if there are questions that you think of after the fact and you want to leave them here on the video, by all means, please do. Again, I'll make this offer every time I do it. If you do not have your own copy of the United States Constitution, please send me a message here, and I will provide you a copy of the Constitution. Send me a message with your address, and I will get it in the mail to you as soon as possible. We've gotten over 150 Constitutions out the door, frankly, I want it to double. I want as many people as possible to have this basic rule book in their pocket. So please, if you don't have one, just let me know. If you're a teacher and you want to have a bunch of these for your students in class, by all means, and I will send them out to you free of charge. Free knowledge. Come get it. Again, my name is Christopher Diorio, and this has been ChrisChat.